introduction, Ashley, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. I think my friend Maddie is here from Pacific, so it's 7 a.m. for her, so she gets a special shout out for joining this early. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so sharing with you the work I've been doing over the last 4 years. I wanted to start out by briefly reflecting on that journey that led me to being here at Virginia Tech. Like Ashley said, I started doing social science in the Park Service at Grand Teton with Jen Newton. I really fell in love with working the outdoors and connecting people to nature, especially with wildlife viewing, because wildlife viewing is such a unique way for people from all walks of life to take a moment and connect with nature. Once I found this program, my CRV and I made the great journey from the Tetons to our home in New Mexico and then east to Cheatham, where I've been working the last 4 years. I really threw myself into that wildlife viewing project when I got to Virginia Tech. Back then and now, whenever I talk about wildlife viewing, I mean closely observing, feeding, or photographing wildlife, visiting parks or natural areas to observe, feed, or photograph wildlife, and maintaining plantings or natural areas for the benefit of wildlife. So we started on that wildlife viewing project, and early on, I went to a presentation where I found that stat that said, hey, 1 in 4 Americans identifies as disabled. This number really stood out to me because some of those people with disabilities are people really close to me who I love. And I knew that while I loved wildlife viewing and really believed in this work, I was really interested in connecting wildlife viewing and disability together at this scholarly or academic level. So with Ashley's help, we wrote that grant and turned the wildlife viewing project into a PhD project. Today, we'll start with a little bit of an introduction to set the landscape of this work. My first 2 chapters I'll share with you are focused on that wildlife viewing survey that we talked about. And my second 2 chapters look at that connection to disability. And we'll close with a brief conclusion that talks about applications to the literature and for conservation. So with that, we're going to roll into the introduction. I wanted to start by sharing some stats about participation in wildlife-related recreation. In the US in 2022, more than half of all Americans participated in wildlife viewing. If we look at other recreation activities like hunting and fishing, we see that there's a lot less participation in those activities compared to wildlife viewing. Those of you who aren't in the field might be surprised to learn that our state fish and wildlife agencies are really structured around hunting and fishing and don't do so much to incorporate wildlife viewing. The reason for this emphasis on hunting and fishing is because here in the US, we follow the North American model of wildlife conservation. This really centers those people who hunt and fish, as well as those game species in conservation management, because they are that financial backbone for conservation through purchasing licenses and things that are taxed and the money goes back to our agencies. So in turn, this has led to our state fish and wildlife agencies being really closely connected with people who hunt and fish. This model has been in place for about a century or so, depending on who you ask. And while it's worked really well for a long time, there's been some challenges that have emerged in the 21st century. First, we're seeing an increasing disconnection between people and nature. More people are moving into these urban areas, and people are spending less time recreating outdoors. This has translated into a plateau or decline of participation in hunting or fishing in many states, but not all. So now state agencies are really faced with this challenge to connect with the public beyond those traditional audiences of wildlife viewers. And it's a big problem to tackle, and thankfully there's a roadmap for this called the Fish and Wildlife Relevancy Roadmap that was written by state agencies for state agencies that looks at how agencies can connect to a broader constituency. And this really was kind of the backbone of my work here at Virginia Tech, as it found that studying wildlife viewers is a key step to addressing problems related to conservation and wildlife management. There's lots of reasons that it's important and interesting for us to study wildlife viewers. First, we know that they're a critical audience for state fish and wildlife agencies. Wildlife viewers are already interested in some wildlife in their state, so there's already a little bit of a common ground for them to come together and connect with their agencies. Wildlife viewers also care about protecting species and habitat. They're especially interested in protecting endangered or vulnerable species, so they can be supportive of efforts to protect those species. Also, wildlife viewers are a rapidly growing audience. That means understanding them more and connecting with them more will help state agencies really broaden their reach of who they're working with. And finally, and very importantly, wildlife viewers participate in lots of conservation behaviors. These behaviors can include voting or advocating on the behalf of conservation, but it can also include making financial contributions to conservation, like donating to state agencies or purchasing products or license from state agencies. When I got to Virginia Tech, I took a look at the past research done about wildlife viewers. There's been lots of studies done at the national level and some at the state level, and they mainly focus on like what species wildlife viewers are interested in, where they go wildlife viewing, and how much they spend on wildlife viewing. But we pretty quickly found a gap in the field looking at wildlife viewing, specifically understanding facilitators. Facilitators are factors that support a person's participation in an activity. And there's lots of reasons that it can be really interesting to study those facilitators. Number one, they can help us to identify actionable items to incorporate into planning steps as we connect with a new audience. And they also can be very critical in recruiting new people into wildlife viewing and retaining those existing wildlife viewers. Because while there's already lots of Americans wildlife viewing, we want to understand what makes them tick and how we can really keep connecting with them. So with that, I'll go into these 4 chapters, sharing a little bit more about facilitators of wildlife viewing. My first chapter is a throwback to the COVID pandemic, which was just wrapping up when I started grad school. This chapter is called Locked Down and Looking Out in the United States, examining social influences for wildlife viewers during the COVID-19 pandemic. I worked on this with 4 co-authors, and the manuscript is in review with People in Nature. A little bit of background in case you forgot. In March 2020, in March 2020, the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus to be a global pandemic. In response to that, lots of governments nationwide and worldwide implemented these stay-at-home orders to help to reduce the spread of the virus. During that time, people weren't able to recreate as much in their traditional activities, so some people turned to birding and wildlife viewing, as noted with increased observations of wildlife in platforms like eBird. So the COVID-19 pandemic created a really unique opportunity for us to study some changes in participation in wildlife viewing. To do this work, we turned to 2 frameworks from the hunting literature to guide our research. The first framework from the hunting literature I want to talk with you about is the R3 framework. This is already used really commonly in state fish and wildlife agencies for hunters and anglers, so it might be a reminder for some of you. But for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it starts with the first phase, recruit. In this phase, someone is kind of recruited into an activity and they're new and start participating into it for the first time. In time, those recruited folks move into the retained group, which means they've been participating in the activity for a long time. But not everybody sticks around, and those folks who leave the activity are called the churn group. And those are people who had been participating for a while, but then they stopped. Sometimes those folks come back to the activity and they're called the reactivated group. And this is a really useful framework for looking at recreation because it can help us group people into these 4 kind of different categories and learn a little bit more about their needs and what might help them participate or come back to the activity. The second framework we looked to for this work was the social habitat for hunting. This was developed by a social scientist named Lincoln Larson, and it looks at 4 levels of influence in an activity. The first level of influence is called the individual influence. And in our work, we considered this someone's identity as a wildlife viewer. The second level of influence is the micro influence. And in our study, we consider that to be support from family. The third level of influence is meso influence, and this was participation in state agency programs and services. And the fourth level in this social habitat framework is the macro influence, like policies. In this study, we used a supplemental data set from Jill et al. That looked at the number of COVID-19 restrictions by state. So in this chapter, we were interested in how wildlife viewers were distributed across recreation groups during COVID-19 and their reported support at different levels of that social habitat framework. We looked at a lot of research questions. The first one was related to ethno-racial identity, gender, and age of wildlife viewers. The second one looked at self-reported skill level of wildlife viewers across these 4 groups. Our third research question looked at the number of COVID-19 restrictions and how that influenced recreation group. And our fourth research question looked at recreation groups of a wildlife viewer associated with their reported identity as a viewer, family support, and state agency support. That's a lot of questions and it was a lot of work. So as Professor Lockhart says, for full details, please see my published work. We're only going to be working on this presentation on about one research question for each chapter. So the question I wanted to share with you today is looking at how does the recreation group of a wildlife viewer associate with their reported identity as a wildlife viewer, family support in wildlife viewing, and participation in state agency programs. So with that, we'll shift into our methods from this chapter. To investigate these research questions, we conducted a panel survey of wildlife viewers across the United States. Panel surveys are surveys done by these companies that recruit participants and then help distribute surveys to them and share some compensation with them for completing the survey. So we made the survey and contracted with a group who handled administering it. This research was done in partnership with lots of folks from state fish and wildlife agencies. They helped guide the questions we were asked, influence our approach with the questions, and coming to the results of this work. So I wanted to thank them for informing that, and I think it gave our work a really unique lens because we were really focused on this connection to agencies. Our sampling instrument was that online survey. It was 117 questions long. It took folks about 15 minutes to complete. And we administered this survey in the summer of 2021 online to wildlife viewers across the United States. For analysis for this research question, we used a little mix between SPSS, which is the statistical package for social science, and RStudio. We conducted binomial logistic regressions, and we were looking at that individual micro and meso levels of support. Our reference group, so who we were comparing everyone to, were those retained wildlife viewers. And our results are reported as odds ratios, looking at the differences between groups. And our data was weighted according to regions from the US. So look at our results. So first we wanted to see how people broke down in those recreation groups. From our sample of about 4,030 wildlife viewers, 56% of them were retained as wildlife viewers, meaning they were wildlife viewing before COVID and they kept on wildlife viewing during that first year of the pandemic. 13% of our respondents were reactivated wildlife viewers. That meant they had been wildlife viewing in the past, but once COVID started, they weren't actively doing it, and then they came back to the activity during that first year of the lockdowns. 7% of our respondents were recruited into the activity, meaning they started participating in wildlife viewing for the first time during COVID. We found that 24% of our respondents were churned from wildlife viewing. That meant that they had been participating in wildlife viewing during the couple years leading up to COVID, but once COVID started, they were no longer able to participate for a variety of reasons. Now we're going to move into our results looking at that social habitat framework. The first thing we're going to look at is the identity influence. And these are the odds ratios. If these graphs are new to you, what we've got up here on the top with this dotted line is the reference group, and that's retained wildlife viewers. These little dots and lines throughout the rest of the graph are the odds ratios and the confidence interview. And this is kind of looking at the odds of how different those groups were with that support from our reference group, which is the retained viewers. And finally, the thing to look for as you're checking out these graphs is any group that crosses this dotted line from the reference group means they don't have significantly different odds of support at that level from the retained group, so they're kind of similar. So how we interpret this graph is we see that our recruited and our churned participants don't cross that dotted line, so that meant that they reported lower odds of identity as a wildlife viewer than the retained viewers who had been viewing the whole time. Moving on to our family influence, or that micro level, again, those recruited folks are kind of sticking out a little bit, and they're still reporting lower odds of support than the retained participants. We saw some changes up at that meso or state agency support, and our reactivated and churned wildlife viewers reported much higher odds of participating in state agency programs and services. And my theory with that churned group being so high is that I think they were looking for support from their agencies and they were checking out a few things, but they couldn't find a program or support that really resonated with them and helped them stay in the activity. To move into our discussion, a reminder of our research question, we were looking at differences across these groups. From our first research question, we found those identity, so recruited wildlife viewers, churned and retained wildlife viewers recorded lower levels of identity. With that family support, recruited wildlife viewers had lower support than retained. On our third level, the state agencies, reactivated and churned wildlife viewers had higher support than retained. This takes us into our discussion from this chapter. So first, it was an example of advancing some applications from hunter participation theory. We think this could be a really viable framework for studying wildlife viewers in the future. We were able to generate some actionable recommendations about how to support new participants in wildlife viewing by looking at the support that resonated with other groups. And for some future research from this chapter, we'd be really interested in learning a little bit more about that churn group. Is it normal for every year for about 25% of people to leave an activity? And what activities or support could bring those churn folks back? So with that, we're going to shift gears from chapter 1 into chapter 2. And the title for this is More Recreation, More Specialization, examining the influence of participating in hunting and fishing on wildlife viewing specialization. So for a little bit of background, an emerging theme in the literature and from my work in the field with state fish and wildlife agencies is that managing for wildlife viewing can be contrary to the interests of those people who hunt and fish. At the same time, I came across this concept of multidimensionality, which was from the Dare Lab's work. And multidimensionality looks at how many individuals can identify with and be both consumptive, so hunters and anglers, and wildlife viewers. So while we kind of hear that there's like this competition between hunters and anglers and wildlife viewers, turns out that a lot of the times they can be the same people. In 2022, 89% of people who fish also participated in wildlife viewing, and 91% of people who hunt also participated in wildlife viewing, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we're starting to see in the literature that they can be the same people. The other piece of background I wanted to cover with you all is specialization. And this is a measure of intensity of involvement in the activity. It kind of looks at someone's overall relationship with the activity. It was initially developed for angling or fishing, which is why there was a fishing icon for this chapter. And scholars in specialization break it down into 3 different dimensions. We can consider this to be our highly specialized birder, and they're thinking for their effective dimension, this is the most important thing I do. So that means that wildlife viewing or birding's really important to them and kind of central in their lives. On the behavioral dimension of wildlife viewing, they're thinking, I do this every weekend. So that means they do it all the time, and it's one of those things they participate in a lot. And finally, at the cognitive level with specialization, they're thinking, I'm so good at this. So that means their self-rated skill level for the activity would be pretty high. So in this chapter, we were interested in investigating how multidimensionality as a recreator is associated with specialization in wildlife viewing. So we were just interested in looking at how does wildlife viewing specialization differ between wildlife viewers who also hunt and or fish and those who don't. To investigate these research questions, we used that same panel survey I talked about in the first chapter, and we compared 2 groups. Our first group was wildlife viewers only, and our second group was wildlife viewers who also fish and or hunt. For the analysis, we used multiple linear regression models to examine the differences in specialization at these 3 dimensions. We accounted for some demographic characteristics that you'll see, but we won't get into today. And to compute the overall specialization score, we weighted each of these dimensions using an exploratory factor analysis and combined them for an overall score following methods from Rudder et al. For results from this chapter, just to look at that breakdown of our respondents, we found that 54% of our respondents, so 54% out of those about 4,000 wildlife viewers, were wildlife viewers only. That meant that 46% of our respondents fell into that hunter-angler viewers group. We definitely heard more from people who fish. 29% of respondents participated in fishing and wildlife viewing, 3% participated in hunting and wildlife viewing, and 14% were what I call the very busy group, and they fish, hunt, and view wildlife. And for the analysis, we combined all of these into one group called those like multi-dimensional recreationists. These are the results from our analysis. And what I really want to just focus on is our betas for looking at being a hunter or an angler was positive and significant for all three dimensions. So what this tells us is that participating in hunting and or fishing is associated with a higher level of specialization. Taking a look at our overall specialization score, we found the same thing. Again, we're seeing our betas for participating in hunting or fishing is associated with a slightly higher level of specialization. For the folks who are a little bit more visual, this is a violin plot that kind of looks at the density or how people fell between these two groups. This purple group is the wildlife viewers only, and the green group is the wildlife viewers and hunters and anglers. And you can see that it was a little bit thicker up top for those hunters and anglers. So we are seeing that they have slightly higher levels of specialization. And our wildlife viewers, it's a little bit thicker down at the bottom. So the wildlife viewers only were a little bit less specialized. So this takes us into our discussion. As a reminder, with our research question, we were comparing specialization between wildlife viewers who also hunt and or fish and those who don't. We found that at all dimensions of specialization, those wildlife viewers who hunt and or fish reported higher specialization than wildlife viewers only. For our discussion from this chapter, our findings imply that people who hunt and fish are some of the most avid wildlife viewers. So this is a little bit contrary to those notion that those groups are in conflict with one another because they can be the same people at times. And this implies that managing for wildlife viewing can support diverse interests and different recreationists. In future research, something I would be really interested in exploring is the relationship between those activities. In our sample, we saw a lot more wildlife viewers who participate in fishing. So I'm interested to see, can wildlife viewing be a gateway activity into fishing, or can fishing lead to wildlife viewing, and learning a little bit more about those relationships. So with that, we're going to close the door on our survey research and move into looking at the disability projects. Chapter 3 is titled Accessible Birding in the United States, Constraints to and Facilitators of Birding with Disabilities. One of our co-authors is an alum from this department, Morgan. You might recognize her. For a little bit of background on disability, the CDC defines disability as any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. Disability comes in all shapes and sizes, and it can impact someone's vision, hearing, or movement, as well as cognition, which means thinking and learning and remembering, a person's mental health, as well as forming those social relationships. And as we said at the top, according to the CDC, about 1 in 4 Americans are disabled. So this is a really large chunk of the population that we're considering. I also wanted to define neurodivergence, which means that someone's brain processes information differently from the typical brain. And some examples of neurodivergence includes ADHD or autism. And worldwide, about 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent. So again, when we're considering people who are disabled and neurodivergent, it's a really large audience. As I started doing this work early on in my degree, I was struggling a little bit with learning how can I connect disability exactly to wildlife viewing. And I stumbled upon this really cool thing called models of disability. Elizabeth Smart defines models of disability as a set of guiding assumptions, concerns, and propositions. They're human-made tools for understanding and human-made guidelines for action. Essentially, models of disability are different ways to understand disability. I like to think of them as lenses we use to understand disability. There's dozens of models of disability. In the paper, we talk about, I think, 12 or 13, but today I'm going to share with you 5 models of disability that you may or may not already be using. The first model of disability is the medical model of disability, and this sees disability as something to be treated or cured or fixed through these medical interventions. The second model of disability is the charity model of disability, and this sees disability as something to be pitied. And in this model, disabled people rely on non-disabled people for help. And in the literature, I'm definitely seeing a little bit of a rejection of this charity model, as it kind of puts disabled people or non-disabled people above disabled people. And disabled people are kind of rejecting these notions of feeling like they need pity from non-disabled people. A newer model I came across is the geographic model of disability, and this sees disability as the result of a physical environment a person is in. So for example, if someone maybe had an injury to their knee or leg and they couldn't bend it to go upstairs, we wouldn't say that they were disabled by the injury in their knee. We would say that they were disabled by the presence of stairs in their environment. So if there was a ramp like we have in this room or an elevator and the stairs were removed, they would no longer be considered disabled by their physical environment. Another model of disability is the identity model of disability, and this sees disability as a positive component of one's identity. In this model, we can kind of see cultures and groups forming around certain disabilities as folks share that in common and kind of celebrate their identity within that. And the final model of disability I want to share with you today is the social model of disability. And this sees disability as the responsibility of society. So if a person is in a place and it's inaccessible to them and they can't navigate it, we would say it's the responsibility of society to make that space more accessible to them. So in this work, we were interested in which models of disability disabled and neurodivergent birders invoked when discussing their facilitators of birding. Our research question was, what models of disability do disabled birders invoke when talking about support in birding? To investigate these research questions, we used a survey of disabled birders on Google Forms. This was administered in late 2020, and it was designed and led by my colleague and co-author Freya McGregor before she came to Virginia Tech. To analyze this results, we conducted qualitative coding. Qualitative coding is something we do as social scientists where we looked at large transcripts and we come up with these codes or themes to kind of highlight emerging themes within the data. So we tag all of those quotes that fall into this theme and we organize it for later analysis. In this project, we use deductive coding. So you see this upside down triangle here. And that means that our code book was based on existing theory. So we looked at those models of disability, those became our codes, and we tagged when they emerged. This analysis was done in Google Sheets with Freya McGregor and Morgan Carnes helping with analysis. We conducted additional analysis from that big survey of wildlife viewers. We don't have time to dive into that today, but we looked at how disabled and non-disabled birders compared. So for our results, I first wanted to give you a couple examples of those codes I was talking about. The first, with the social model, a birder said, bird trips geared to specific disabilities would be helpful, especially if the leader is knowledgeable about limitations. In this example, the birder is sharing, hey, the way birding trips are designed isn't super accessible to me. So if my disability or disabilities were centered a little bit more in how we lead programs, it would feel more accessible to me. The second quote I wanted to share with you is from that geographic model of disability. And a birder shared with us, how about a trail designated for big sit birders, where an accessible path or boardwalk leads to a quiet area? How nice if it included a bench for those not using wheelchairs, near a good birding spot off the main trail where one could stay for a while and observe the birds. So in this quote, the birder is challenging us to think about birding trails. A lot of the times they're paths kind of designed for movement, but they're saying, hey, if we have some places where we can do stationary birding and sit and rest a little bit and let the birds come to us, that would be more accessible to me. So we want to look at how all of those models emerged when describing facilitators overall. We saw that those social and geographic models really popped out the most. We also saw no instances of the medical or charity model of disability, and that zero from the medical makes sense as it wasn't done in a medical context. But that zero with the charity model told us that when we're looking at how to facilitate inclusive experiences for people with disabilities, they don't want that pity that we see from the charity model of disability. So to move into our discussion, we were looking at models of disability birders invoked when talking about support in birding. We found that that social and geographic model most commonly emerged. For our discussion from this piece, we recommended using the social and geographic models to resonate with birders with disabilities. Under these models, we need to change attitudes, awareness, and physical designs of birding locations to increase accessibility and inclusion. And some future research that could be done from this could be focus groups to learn about specific recommendations for how to make programs and places more inclusive. And that's exactly what we did in chapter 4, the last chapter of my dissertation. The working title for this chapter is Facilitators of Wildlife Viewing for Disabled and Neurodivergent Participants in the United States. As a reminder from the top, facilitators are factors that support participation in an activity. This definition is pulled from Raymore's facilitator framework. And the first level of this framework is intrapersonal. Those facilitators are considered a person's motivation for participating in activities. So, why are they drawn to it? The second level of this framework is interpersonal, and that looks at the people and groups who support a person in an activity and how they provide the support. The third level of this framework is structural, and that includes locations where people recreate, programs that they participate in while they're recreating, and broader society and policy. We investigated all of these levels of the framework in my work, but today we're only going to be discussing those structural facilitators, specifically programs. So the research question we'll be discussing is, what are the facilitators of inclusive wildlife viewing programs for people who are disabled or neurodivergent? To investigate these research questions, we conducted focus groups. Focus groups are group discussions, normally led by one or two facilitators, where participants can discuss questions with each other and kind of reach a consensus on them. We conducted these focus groups virtually. To analyze the transcripts from this report, we used qualitative coding. And this time we did inductive, so our triangle is flipped and now it's facing right side up. And that means that we allowed themes to emerge from the transcript. So we didn't have a code book set based on theory. After the focus group, we went through the transcripts and noted all of these themes, made a formal code book, and then went back through those transcripts a couple times and marked every time those themes emerged. This analysis was done in Deduce, and my code books and the edit and the coding was done in collaboration with Ashley and Freya. So moving into our results, I just wanted to share a little bit about our groups overall. We held 8 focus groups with a total of 32 participants, and following best practices for inclusive research, they all received a $50 gift card for their time with us. To look at demographics, 66% of respondents identified as neurodivergent, meaning their brains processed information differently from a typical brain. We heard from a really wide spread of different disability types. The most common disability type we heard from was chronic illness. We also heard a lot from folks who had mental health disabilities or challenges with mobility challenges. A little bit less from folks whose disabilities were related to hearing, cognition, and vision. And about 15% of our respondents said that the list of disabilities we provided didn't accurately capture their disability. And I just wanted to note here that oftentimes a disability does not exist singularly within a certain person, and lots of people can have multiple disabilities at the same time. So our results looking at inclusive programs, one of the biggest themes that emerged was to provide information ahead of time. And we saw this consistently across all levels of facilitators. And the reason information is so important for people with disabilities or who are neurodivergent is that they know what they can or can't do. But they need this information in order to determine if a program or if a wildlife viewing location is going to be accessible to them. So some of the information that they'd like to hear more about when advertising wildlife viewing programs is trail information. So are there steps? What's the material? Is it really steep? How do we, yeah. They were also interested in bathroom availability. Like we said with the demographics, we heard from a lot of folks with chronic illnesses, and sometimes that means they need to have access to bathrooms. People with disabilities also said they really like to know the itinerary ahead of time with their programs. So this includes start and end time, where to meet program leaders, as well as the estimated walking or traveling distance of a program. Participants were also really interested in having access to places to sit or rest, as well as knowing about the group size. With that target audience, some folks, especially those who are neurodivergent, feel really overwhelmed in those large crowds. So having information about the target audience, about how many people will be there, are there adults or kids, will help them know what to prepare for and help them to know if that program is a good fit for them. We also talked about the design of wildlife viewing programs. So one thing we heard a lot about was the timing of programs, including the time of day. So some people with disabilities that we talked to, they need a little help in the morning to get ready, get showered, get out the door. And so these super early morning programs just wouldn't work for them. We also did the focus groups in the summer when it was super hot. So some people said, hey, a program in the heat of the day is tough for me because it takes me a long time to cool down. People really appreciated multiple formats for sharing information. So an example of that today, I'm talking to you, but I also have these slides with little pictures on them and there's words. So if you don't following exactly what I'm saying, you can look at the pictures or read the words. That was really helpful for disabled and neurodivergent wildlife viewers as well. Participants also said they liked their programs to move slowly and be open to adapting. One person told us that they had tried to go to a wildlife viewing program and the leader moved so fast that they couldn't keep up and they had to leave the program early. Participants also liked when instructors adapted the program. So if they could tell everyone in the program wasn't really connecting, maybe shifting your material or talking about something different so you can connect with the audience. And again, they really appreciated breaks built in near rest areas. Number one change for physical accessibility that we found in our work is just the presence of benches or having somewhere for people to sit and rest. We saw that again in programs, and that's why I have a picture of everyone sitting on this log in a program. And finally, participants also appreciated loaner equipment, so extra binoculars or maybe umbrellas to help them in the program, especially if they were beginners. A couple other program considerations we heard about were transportation options. So, not everybody with a disability can drive, and some of them were really reliant on public transportation or carpools or being driven by friends or family. So, thinking about where programs are and if they could be near a bus stop was one thing we heard about. Virtual programming was something we heard about. We had a lot of opinions on that. Some people said, hey, virtual programs don't work with me. I can't connect to information on Zoom. But some folks said, hey, I love virtual programs. With my disabilities, I can't go to a lot of these remote environments, but virtual programs help me experience nature and view wildlife I wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. Finally, we also heard that the attitudes of others were really important. Participants said that with their disabilities, they didn't want to be judged or stared at, and they hoped there was better understanding from leaders and participants. A quote from our focus groups that illustrates that is one person shared, I think the more our culture shifts toward understanding what disability actually is and means, the more welcoming and accepting certain outdoor activities will feel for disabled folks. So moving into our discussion, we were looking at how can wildlife viewing programs be more inclusive for people with disabilities and who are neurodivergent. We found that number one recommendation really was sharing detailed information in advance. This could be having contact information on flyers, adding more info to your flyers, and things like that. It was also really important to be able to take breaks, slow down while you're walking if everybody can't keep up. Make sure there's places for people to sit if you're going to be talking for a while, as well as having those welcoming attitudes. So when leaders and participants knew more about disabilities and worked to be more inclusive, it was a more positive experience for everyone. So this brings us into our discussion. One of the things we found is a lot of these changes could be made with minimal or zero negative environmental impact. So information and sharing all of that in advance isn't something that's going to hurt sensitive habitat. These findings were similar to past research done with disabled recreationists in different activities like hiking or canoeing. So we're kind of seeing like a general body of literature for inclusive programs emerge. And we also found that there's really a need for greater awareness and understanding of people with disabilities. So going back to the start, 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. It's a really large population. And sometimes people with disabilities kind of feel invisible or like they're not seen within their society. And some future research recommendations, we think this work could be done targeted to specific disabilities to give a little bit more of a detailed playbook for folks looking to be inclusive. So this brings me into the conclusion from my work. I'll start first by talking about the contributions to theory. From chapter 1, we really kind of expanded applications of theory. In this manuscript, we started to apply that R3 and the social habitat framework from hunting and fishing to wildlife viewing. I think it's a really promising application for management and research. And in chapter 2, we further validated that concept of multidimensionality from Bennett Grooms and wildlife-related recreation. We really worked to connect disconnected fields with our final 2 chapters. In chapter 3, we had new applications of models of disability. Doing this work, I was pulling from lots of stuff, leisure literature, occupational therapy. I was even reading like religious journal articles about how they see disability. And it was a really big project to bring lots of different fields together and present them in a way that it was relevant to wildlife-associated recreation. And for chapter 4, we further applied Raymore's facilitator framework in wildlife viewing. So we're seeing these new tests of this theory with a different activity. And I wanted to close by talking about our contributions to conservation. So in 2022, after we finished our wildlife viewing report and some of the analysis from these first chapters, we were talking to our agency partners, and we still felt like there was kind of a gap between the work that we had done and actions that agencies could take. And so we led and implemented this wildlife viewing community of practice. In this wildlife viewing community of practice, our main goal was to support agencies in developing and implementing research-based plans that were based on those recommendations from our wildlife viewer survey. We also provided agency partners with access to more information about wildlife viewing. We worked to help them address some common barriers to wildlife viewing management. A lot of staff at wildlife viewing state wildlife agencies for wildlife viewing is only about one person. So you might have a whole state and then someone who's only part-time that does wildlife viewing. So a lot of these staff who do wildlife viewing felt kind of isolated because they didn't have colleagues in their state who are working on the same things. And in the community of practice, we were able to connect wildlife viewing staff from all over North America and help to promote this environment of shared learning and have people bounce ideas off one another in a way that they didn't really have a chance to do a lot otherwise. And this project was documented in a story map we made on our website that looked at all of the states and their plans they made for wildlife viewing. With our final work, so those chapters 3 and 4 with disability, we've been working to really spread the word, gone to lots of conferences, and we've built out a new page on our website that has all of our deliverables, handouts, and downloads, lots of YouTube videos for people who are interested in increasing accessibility and inclusion in wildlife viewing. They have a really great resource and lots of research to lean on. And after I leave, Ashley and Freya are going to keep doing this work with case study research, looking at agencies that are a success for this accessibility and inclusion. So other states will have a really great example to lean on as they do this work. So in conclusion, I hope that all of these pieces come together to help state agencies and the general public better understand wildlife viewers and create these pathways to support them with this extra focus on accessibility and inclusion for people who are disabled and neurodivergent. I want to move into our acknowledgements. The first people I want to thank is my survey respondents and focus group participants. My committee, Shelly flew in from Texas, so I can't see her. I really appreciate her being here. All of my co-authors for helping so much. My community here with the DARE Human Dimensions Lab and with the FIGSWA, so all the graduate students, it's great to see you. This project was funded by the Multi-State Conservation Program. We worked through 3 grants, so we really appreciate that funding to help this important work happen. I wanted to give a special thank you to state agencies. I think the most learning I did throughout this was from really embedding myself with them and the work, and I learned so much from talking to them, joining their meetings, and getting their feedback. So I'm really grateful so many people took the time to help me with my growth. I would also like to thank Eric Brooks, who's our audio engineer, for running Zoom. He's also my boyfriend, so thank you for doing that. My family came here from New Mexico, so thank you for my support. I know you guys, like wildlife viewing was a very different path. Eric's family for being my home away from home and lots of journeys. And the people the friends I found along the way and the people that were in my life before, and so many other people who I weren't able to have pictures taken with. Oh, and my cat, I got her when I was in elementary school and I'm finishing my PhD and she's been with me for all of that. We told her we were going to do a PhD defense and she didn't care because she's a cat. And I also want to thank you, my audience and everybody on Zoom for listening to me, and I hope you learned something new today. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. As Emily said, we have some time for questions now. Would anyone like to start it off, Sarah?
Well, congratulations. Thank you for that. So regarding the last chapter, so I was curious, a lot of folks get into birding in particular through bird clubs, groups. And so I was wondering if you know of, are the state agencies thinking of translating your work to bird clubs to then, is there's.
So a lot of the focus group participants actually talked about bird clubs as one of those groups, sorry, people who are really pivotal to their support. And it did vary. Like some groups they felt like were a little exclusive, but some were more inclusive. And there's been a really big effort called Birdability, which works on making birding more accessible. And that has lots of templates to evaluate locations and recommendations for that. So that's one thing we're recommending. And another recommendation from that is for agencies to consider those communities and see where there's options to kind of like tap into those birding groups to help support the activity. Nate, I saw your hand first.
Yeah, first off, great presentation and just incredibly impressive amount of work that it's in. Mine is kind of getting at the research implementation gap, thinking about your disability and neurodivergence work. If you were to consult with an agency or be asked by an agency for your opinions, what is, do you think, the strongest recommendation that would have the biggest impact for the most amount?
Recommendation. I think I'll do two. So for physical design, my number one recommendation is definitely a bench. There's so many people with disabilities and they're able to kind of go out on a trail, but they might get tired faster and they just need to rest before carrying on. And benches are such a great tool to promote accessibility. And my second overall recommendation, I think, would just be more awareness. The reason I started with those stats of like 1 in 4 people has a disability, thinking about outreach, we don't always like disability and accessibility doesn't come to mind. But I think the more people are aware of those stats and a little bit more of an understanding of how to be inclusive, I think that could help just to get it on their radar. So
That always sense.
So I'm curious for the 4th chapter, how you recruited people for the focus groups. I just asked because we conducted them on Zoom, but also one of the findings was that some people didn't like the virtual platform. So I'm wondering if like some people were left out of participating in focus groups and how that might have impacted results or like what perspectives were left out.
So we recruited these focus groups primarily through social media. We had some social media cards. Our state agency partners sent the recruitment survey out on email. And so there's definitely a chance we missed folks who just weren't on social media or weren't on those email lists. One of the big reasons we decided to do Zoom is just because, especially if you're disabled, it can be a little harder to navigate to a central location. And we chose Zoom because it provided people with the option to participate from their own home. And I think other research, I actually wrote a grant for my grants class that would have done this project at a state agency level. And that could have been done with like more place-based or like at birding locations in the future. Yeah.
So Kelsey.
No Zoom questions yet. So if people on Zoom have questions, please put them in the chat.
Oh,
while
yes.
watching. But I'm curious, since we're seeing attacks on DEI work and the political environment's changed pretty dramatically since you started this work, how would you recommend state and federal agencies go forward as they're trying to include more DEI work?
Focusing on target audiences is a really good way to continue to do this work. So how we can frame understanding disability work is we're just trying to make our material like connect more with a very specific audience. And I think if we're looking at and these relevancy efforts, if we kind of think about it almost from a marketing lens of like targeted advertising, targeted marketing, targeted messaging, that's a way to kind of implement these results and still kind of connect to the people we're looking to reach.
We probably have time for one more question if anyone's got one.
Got one online.
Okay.
Was there an economic model examined, as participation in viewing often can be expensive and limit on ability to get involved? For example, binoculars, guides, transportation, etc.
Yeah, I don't have the graphs with us, but we collected data on their household income and definitely looked at how that related to specialization. That was one of those first things we looked at, and it did feel a little bit tied into the overall privilege of the recreationists because the people who had higher income were often had higher levels of education as well, and then therefore were more specialized. So it ties into a lot more of those big picture things that can influence participation.
All right, I think our time is up here. Please make sure you return the party favors to me. I promised I'd give them to my kids. And please join me again in congratulating Emily. Emily's committee is going to be meeting over in TM in the
With a
bear.
taxidermy bear.